So over to you, Cheryl.
Hi. The culture wars online and off are vicious and really kind of, you have to fit into this binary of either, a kind of fawning adulation, or maybe just posting kittens, or a nasty kind of spiteful trolling and name calling. And I try to keep out of all that as much as I can. I don't go on Twitter very much at all. My comments really are going to be more about the kind of the ideas in the book, the history in the book, the politics in the book. So the kind of online culture wars do leave me cold. But I have seen online some of the reaction to Angela's book, and they do tend to fit into those two categories, either a kind of fawning adulation or a kind of nice, nasty, spiteful trolling, right? And I really hope that today in this forum we can all be a little bit more subtle about it and discuss the book and the ideas in the book, with a bit more kind of complexity and sensitivity. I read the book in the summer. I really liked the book. It did open up a world to me that I wasn't very familiar with. I was first introduced to it by Angela in her Baffler article on 4chan, which I immediately kind of recognized in that article that here was someone who could think seriously about the problems that we're facing, that she was somebody who was very thorough in her work, and that somebody that we should be taking seriously. One of the reviews of the book, a review by James Livingston, called her an old lefty's idea of what a young lefty should be. And, and while I resist the label old, as someone who has been around the left in both the UK and the US for around 30 years, I was delighted to see some kind of a re-emergence of some kind of critical, truly radical thinking in the next generation. So I have a couple of questions. I've been asked to pose some questions to Angela. I'm going to do that in a kind of friendly vein, but mildly critical. And I wanted to just take a minute to say what I really like about the book, what I think the book does really well, and why it's such a great contribution to the discussion today. And actually, the things I'm going to mention are things which haven't really been part of the discussion around the book in the aftermath, and things that maybe they should be more kind of at the centre of our thinking about these issues. So beyond the general kind of great mass of eye-opening information about the rise of the alt-right, and the many insights into internet culture and how dystopian it's become. And when I only joined Twitter last year, and I think I clicked twice and came across some anti-Semitic kind of rant, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so right about Twitter. So anyway, I tried to avoid it. But what I really like about the book is its recognition of the ubiquitous nature of rebellion, or a rebellious stance. So the kind of rejection of conformity, of wanting to adopt an outsider's mantle, but without there being any real content to that rebellion, no direction given for the protest. And so that it becomes a kind of empty posturing, and that therefore both left and right can equally fill that kind of empty shell, and claim to be the rebels. The push or the motivation behind the rebellion is a distaste for the mainstream, hence the title of the book, the mainstream, the normies. And I think that the book really understands that, so that while the left and right subcultures have different solutions to the problem, they are oppositional to one another and at each end, but what they share is a deeply anti-democratic distrust or dislike or even active hatred for the majority of their fellow citizens. So that's the first thing that I like that the book really highlights, and I don't think has really been discussed much in the aftermath. And the second thing I like about it is that Angela is brave enough to engage in some self-examination as a leftist. She follows in the tradition of George Orwell here in the UK and Christopher Lasch in the US, of making herself very unpopular among her own people. And she does that by forcing them to take a long, hard look in the mirror and to deal with the limitations of the left. As she says, you know, most of the attacks or the criticisms of the book have come from leftists. I was defending the book on Corey Robbins' Facebook thread feed about it, and I was asked whether I believed that trans women were women. And I just thought, what on earth has that got to do with anything I've said? And it was, you know, it was this kind of Stalinist re-educator who was kind of so intolerant that if anybody likes that book, it must mean that they are transphobic. It's just completely crazy to me. And the chapter on the Tumblr liberalism in the book was the best part for me, and I wanted more of it. You know, I really thought there could have been another chapter on that. So, but the left obviously don't like it, and it has been the kind of backlash to that chapter that's dominated the discussion since. Okay, so that's what I like about it. So I'm going to ask you a question now. My first question is speaking to the history and the nature of the outsider status that's kind of set up here. So I've mentioned to you before Grace Hale's book on called The Nation of Outsiders, which is about that kind of cultural outsider being part of the American way of being, and that really it kind of exists, a rejection of the mainstream exists in American culture, and it has done for a long time over the course of its history. There's a desire to be seen as more real, more authentic, all the way from 19th century kind of minstrelry through James Dean, through Bob Dylan, you know, these kind of cultural icons. And she includes conservatives among that. And she actually points out that William Buckley, who you know, was really the first person to kind of cultivate this oppositional style against campus liberal orthodoxy. So he developed an idea of the liberal elite and develops a model of the conservative rebel kind of rebelling against that domination of the liberals. You can see as well in George W. Bush, he kind of developed this folksy image, you know, the Texas rancher and everything. Even if they're not outsiders, they want to present themselves as outsiders from the mainstream. So my question then is, what is new about that today? Is it just that it's the platform? Is it the internet that kind of makes the reach broader? Or is this just a problem of modernity? And Marshall Berman discusses this and understands it as a problem of modernity, kind of this loss of authenticity and always a kind of reaching back for it. Or is there something more specific about the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's significant that, you know, that it is coming from America. I mean, now you see a lot more, like on alt-right forums and stuff like that, there's a lot more European voices in there. But a lot of the time they're more just like recognizably far right. You know, this as a kind of subculture or a set of subcultures, you know, is a very American thing. And I think that possibly has to do not just with modernity, but with maybe a lack of a, coming from a very young country, and in many cases, you know, being maybe just a few generations in from, you know, immigrants and so on, that because there isn't a normative kind of national culture maybe or something like that, you have to define yourself in terms of some uniqueness that you have. Like a very interesting example is, I'm fascinated now, maybe it'll be the next thing I write about, the Catholic internet, or like Catholic Twitter. And it's very interesting because, you know, I met some of the people who are involved in First Things magazine, for example, which is a very highbrow, sort of very intellectual Catholic magazine. But the funny thing about them is, and I hope they, if they ever see this, they'll not be offended by me saying this, but they all have these waspy names, and they're all converts, and they wear quite sort of young fogey clothes, and they're really hyper intellectual. And you know, I met one of them, and she was very interesting, very smart, and I was saying, oh, so are you a convert as well? I'm not a convert, but she was there with other converts. And she said yes, and I asked her about how she converted, and it was like a, you know, like a 20-step process, which was this incredibly rational, cerebral kind of process, which started with reading Joyce, and then we ended up at the Jesuits and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, the point I'm getting to is,
and both William Buckley and Milo are
yes,
Catholic, right?
yeah. But you know, so I was thinking, God, the sort of Egypts back home, Catholics back home would would not even be able to have a conversation with these people, because the Catholic Church in Ireland is so uncultivated, and like, but that's because it comes to people naturally, because that's their normative culture, that's what they're born into. It's not part of their identity. Whereas if it's part of your identity, you're placing yourself as an individual outside of the mainstream in some way. Even by being a Catholic, you know, in the American context. So I mean, it is particular to America to some extent, in that those people would not make any sense if you placed them in Ireland, right? Because they'd just be Catholics like most other people. Um, and so it is an American thing, but it's definitely spreading. Like, you know, I think it's more and more common. I mean, I wouldn't say, for example, even certainly my grandparents, even to a large extent my parents' generation, wouldn't have any sense of that you need to be outside of the mainstream, that there's anything good about, you know, they were happy to be, they just didn't conceive of themselves in that way. It just didn't make any sense. Now I think that kind of culture from the US has spread, certainly to the English-speaking world, to such an extent that I think younger people can't even really conceive of themselves, like at a very deep level, who, you know, sort of thinking about who they are. I don't think that they can even really conceive of themselves as having meaning as an individual, without anchoring that to some kind of niche or particular kind of cultural like signifiers. Like, you know, if you go on social media, the first thing you're asked to do is define yourself, you know, in your bio. You're building your personal brand all the time. And this is why I think, I'm rambling a little bit, but this is why I think people get so traumatized when they get attacked online. You know, like some people say, why, well, just get over it, like someone said something mean to you. I think one of the reasons, like John Ronson studied this really well, that people are so affected by it is because the boundary between, you know, some independent or core person, you know, at the core of who you are, and that brand that you have worked on every day for several hours a day, you know, for years on end, is very blurred. And if somebody comes in and essentially destroys the brand, or you know, you have this thing reflected back to you that's telling you you're a terrible person, I think very few people are able to just have a complete separation and say, no, I have some core person that is me, that is not, you know, this niche little perfect individual brand. So I think it's getting worse in that sense, or it's getting more pronounced in that sense, in that there kind of isn't a mainstream anymore. It's not like there's a mainstream and then you have these rebels on the outside. It's all rebels on the outside. I mean, mainstream, the infrastructure of mainstream culture is collapsing. The news, you know, the mainstream media is collapsing. It probably won't even last beyond a couple of years. And so who now who now hasn't participated in the niche, you know, brand making of the self that goes on online? Everyone is doing it now. There is no mainstream, basically.
No, I really would agree with that. And I think that the the mainstream is crumbling, and it's under fire, and it doesn't have any confidence in itself, you know, at the kind of centre. But I think the alt-right and the SJWs, or the Tumblr left, or you know, the people, the small groups really on each side who are attacking them, they are talked about as the problem, right? And they are conceived in your book as the problem. But isn't the real problem that centre that is incapable of holding? Isn't the real problem the kind of mainstream liberal centre, you know, where it has no kind of resonance, where it has no strength, and it has no self-belief, you know? Isn't that in itself a real problem? And do we not need an alternative to it that is not going to depend on its weakness, if you like? So that can become the solution itself, rather than kind of continually feeding on the weakness of the centre. So, you know, the recognition that the reason for Trump, and I think we maybe disagree on this, but the reason for Trump, you know, I don't think was Milo. I think the reason for Trump was Hillary, right? And so the biggest problem is not the alt-right. It's really where the culture wars were won by the left, and the economic battles were won by the right, and you have this kind of extreme individualism, which they both agree on, whether it's identity politics or, you know, capitalism, but they're unable to defend capitalism or liberal individualism, as you mentioned earlier. I mean, you see the Tory party, they found themselves in the position of having to defend capitalism, and they completely were unable to do it. Right? It's like, this is the Tory party, it's just crazy. So in the end, isn't the demand for conformity the bigger problem? And that demand comes from the left much more so than it does from the right.
All right, well, I would just say, I mean, one of the arguments I try to make to others on the left about this is, I don't accept, I mean, most of the people and the particular kind of like subsection or like little culture within the left that I'm critiquing, I don't see that as me attacking the left. I see that as me critiquing a group of people who relentlessly attack the only viable bits of the left, you know? And so I don't see that as me attacking the left. Like, you know, I don't want to say, you know, left and right are meaningless or whatever. Like, obviously, very broadly speaking, it is meaningful. You know, they are meaningful categories, but, you know, I think it's a section of the left, and I think it's very cancerous, and I wish it would go away. And I think the rest of the left would flourish, actually, if it would just if that little tendency, or whatever you want to call it, crankish kind of tendency.
Well, it is like the kind of, it is the censorious, the finger wagging, you know, that kind of, which, you know, is today, it's all over this Me Too campaign, and the kind of sexual harassment being kind of elevated into this, you know, mass crisis for the mainstream. You know, this has come from the left. These kinds of campaigns have come from the left. You know, isn't that a problem, that the demand for conformity comes from the left, that there isn't, and then that gives more scope for the right to say, we are the rebels, you know, and makes them more attractive.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I have, since I've written the book, I've had kind of progressive, like middle-aged academics coming up to me and saying, I'm really worried my son is alt-right. So it has, yeah, like obviously if you're a 13-year-old boy and your parents are like sociology professors or something, it's like there's nowhere else to go. So the right does get to be the fun crowd sometimes with that kind of stuff. But I don't know. I mean, see, if it was like, on the one hand, a lot of this stuff, it always goes too far, to the point where where everyone must repeat whatever it is, the hashtag of the day, or whatever. But at the same time, you know, even say, for example, women on panels, right, is a constant, diversity in general on panels is a constant kind of online war that goes on. And on the one hand, when I see kind of anyone who organizes an event getting sort of attacked for not having diverse enough panels, and they want this like what feels like a very tokenistic head count kind of thing all the time, that is very annoying. But then sometimes I do also think I'm still glad that it's there. I'm annoyed that it's so it's so relentless, and it's so horrible in the way that it goes about what it's doing. But I'm still glad it's there. I mean, it's just to use a kind of example that came to mind. There's this wonderful documentary that I'm always recommending people watch called Rocky Road to Dublin, right? And it's made in 1968, and it's kind of about Ireland being liberalised basically by the 60s. But there's a really interesting scene in it where it's like Trinity students who are all smoking and drinking somewhere in Trinity College, and they're all guys. There's one woman there, and they're all incredibly confident and very articulate and very aggressive, and they're all like, shouting over each other and stuff like that. And this woman who's there kind of tries to get in a couple of times, and she gets in, she manages to say one thing, and they're just like, no, 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 that's stupid. And they just ignore it. And everyone who sees it now kind of is really shocked. But I'm glad that we're shocked by that now. Do you know what I mean? And that didn't happen out of nowhere. Like the liberal kind of cultural left, if you like, did achieve something in at least making us think twice about that kind of stuff. So I don't know how you have one without the other. Maybe the only way you impose new taboos is by being horrible. I don't know.